respects it was, but it was certainly not the year that Canada became independent. As I said, by the mid-1800s, the Canadian governments had gained control over most of the day-to-day things that mattered to Canadians, but the British government retained the power to control fundamental issues relating to the nature of Canada itself. For example, any expansion of Canada's borders had to be authorized by Great Britain, and Britain passed a bunch of such authorizations throughout the 19th and early 20th century, as Canada annexed new territories in North America. And whenever there was some substantial structural change made to the Canadian political system, Britain would have to pass a law approving that too. So for example, in 1915, when the Canadian Senate expanded from 72 to 96 seats, Britain had to approve that. Listen to this. Well into the 1960s and 70s, Britain was still passing laws changing things about the Canadian political system. In 1960, for instance, the British government of Prime Minister Harold Macmillan passed a law ending lifetime tenure for Canadian judges. Or how about in 1975, when Canada's vast Northwest territories were given a second seat in Parliament, thanks to a law passed by the British government of Prime Minister Harold Wilson. Now, of course, Britain was not coming up with these ideas themselves. By this point, they were just blindly rubber stamping whatever random thing the government of Canada asked for. But it was still a weirdly embarrassing situation for Canada to be in just the same. A supposedly modern, first world, developed democracy that was still having to constantly run to its former colonial master for favors. So in 1982, the governments of Canadian Prime Minister Pierre Elliott Trudeau and British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher worked out a deal in which Britain agreed to formally transfer the power to change the Canadian political system over to Canada. After months of negotiation, it all culminated in a big ceremony in Ottawa with Queen Elizabeth on April 17th, 1982, the day Canada finally became completely, utterly, 100% politically independent from Great Britain. Something people in both countries thought was long overdue. The system they worked out was that all of the major laws that Britain had passed over the years affecting Canada in some way would now be compiled together and become a new Canadian Constitution.
I have proclaimed this new constitution, one that is truly Canadian at last.
The old British North America Act was renamed the Constitution Act, 1867, since it laid the foundations of the modern Canadian political system with the Parliament and the provinces and all of that. It is regarded as the main part of the new Canadian Constitution. But there was also a big appendix at the end featuring all of the other laws that Britain had passed about Canada between 1867 and 1982. These were all declared part of the Canadian Constitution as well. Now, this unto itself made the Canadian Constitution a very long and very confusing document. It is comprised of over 30 British colonial statutes that don't really fit together very nicely and are full of all sorts of dated, old-fashioned language that can make it quite hard to understand in the modern context. But from here, things only get more complicated. For you see, at the same time that Britain surrendered control over the Canadian political system, the Trudeau administration, working with the provincial governments, got the British Parliament to pass one final piece of legislation for Canada. It was known as the Constitution Act 1982. Most Canadians will know the Constitution Act 1982 as the part that contains the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. The Charter of Rights and Freedoms was a very bold change to the Canadian political system, probably one of the most consequential changes in all of Canadian history. It articulated a list of the fundamental human rights of all Canadians and said that no government could ever pass a law that violated any of them. This included the right to free speech, freedom of religion, the right to a fair trial, that sort of thing. The Charter of Rights and Freedoms now forms the cornerstone of Canadian human rights law. The government produces this snazzy copy you often find hanging in city halls or whatever. Now, I know what you are thinking. You are thinking, this sounds an awful lot like the Bill of Rights in the US. Well, not quite. But we will get back to that in a sec. Anyway, the Constitution Act 1982 also contained a brand new amending formula explaining how the Canadian Constitution could be changed in the future, seeing as how the old system of just asking Britain had been abolished. And my god, is the new system ever complicated. So essentially the criteria changes depending on what exactly you want to change. So if the Canadian government wants to change something that affects one or more, but not all provinces, then that change has to be approved by the National Parliament of Canada, as well as the government of whatever province is being affected. There have been several amendments made to Canada's constitutional documents in this way since 1982. An example I think most Canadians might be familiar with was a constitutional amendment that was passed in 2001 that changed the name of the province of Newfoundland to the province of Newfoundland and Labrador. Since that obviously only affected one province, that required using this limited one but not all amending formula. All right, does this all make sense so far? Now, a different formula kicks in if you want to make a change that affects any of the following things. The principle that a province's number of seats in the national parliament should correlate with its population, anything to do with the Canadian Senate, the basic regulation of the Supreme Court of Canada, the powers of the provinces and the federal government in general, or if the government wants to alter the borders of Canada's northern territories or create a new province. In any of these cases, a constitutional amendment must be approved by the Parliament of Canada, as well as the governments of at least 7 of Canada's 10 provinces, representing at least 50% of the population of all of the provinces. What this means in practice is that any constitutional amendment has to be passed with the approval of one of Canada's 2 biggest provinces, Ontario and Quebec, because if both Quebec and Ontario object, it is simply mathematically impossible to get enough provinces together that represent more than 50% of the Canadian population. That is how lopsided the population balance is among the provinces. Check this on for size. In 1997, Prime Minister Jean Chrétien passed a law saying that the 7 approving provinces must in fact include Ontario and Quebec, as well as British Columbia, and at least 2 of the 3 prairie provinces, and at least 2 of the 4 Atlantic provinces. At this point, you're basically asking for unanimous consent. A lot of people will argue this law is grossly unconstitutional, but for the time being, Ottawa is still playing along with it. And one of the reasons they're still playing along with it is because there is this whole other part of the Constitution that already demands unanimous provincial consent for big changes. I am referring to Section 41 of the 1982 Constitution Act. In my opinion, it is perhaps the single worst clause in the entire thing, since it really tries hard to permanently lock in some of the most regressive aspects of the Canadian political system. It says every single provincial government must agree if you want to pass a constitutional amendment that affects any of the following things in anyway. The weird rule that says no province can have fewer seats in parliament than it currently has in the Senate, which currently results in over-representation for some of the smaller provinces. Any of Canada's royal figurehead positions, like the status of the British monarch in Canada, or the Governor General. The composition of the Supreme Court, which is generally taken to mean the fact that 3 of the 9 judges are always Quebecers, official French-English bilingualism, and the constitutional amending formula itself. This is one of the really weird things about the Canadian Constitution. The way it tries to protect certain concepts within the Canadian political system from being changed. This is the reason I said no one really knows how long the Canadian Constitution is. Since the constitutional amending formula protects concepts, the exact number of laws in Canada that have constitutional status is kind of unknowable. So here is an example. The Supreme Court of Canada is mostly regulated by the Supreme Court of Canada Act, which was an ordinary law passed by the Canadian Parliament many decades ago. But since the constitutional amending formula says that you cannot change the Supreme Court of Canada without first passing a constitutional amendment, this means that the Supreme Court of Canada Act is basically part of the Constitution too. The Supreme Court of Canada itself actually issued a ruling in 2014 saying that it could not be altered without first passing a constitutional amendment. Kind of a conflict of interest there, but what are you gonna do? There are a lot of other ordinary laws in Canada that deal with things like the powers of the monarchy or the relationship between the federal and provincial governments that could probably be retroactively declared part of the Canadian Constitution too, using this same sort of logic. This whole business of elevating some laws beyond the government's ability to change them is sometimes called judicial supremacy, in contrast to parliamentary supremacy, which is to say, in the old days, the Parliament of either Canada or Britain could pass any sort of law about anything it wanted. But today those laws have to be evaluated by the judiciary to see if they're in sync with the Constitution or not. Now, as you can see,